We're talking about relapse after long-term sobriety. I've got recovered life contributor and interventionist Shauna McKenna Vick on the line. How you doing, Shauna?
I'm doing great, Damon. I get so excited to come on the podcast. We do these every couple of weeks, and you and I just, I love chatting with you, sharing with you, solving the world's problems with you. And so, so I'm happy and excited to be here.
It is always fun when we do a segment together, Shauna, because you bring a lot of really great perspectives, and it's fun too. You have really great recovery. On top of being a professional, and working in this day to day and an expert at this, you have great recovery. And I think that shines through. And that's what this is really, the Recovered Life Show is all about. It's like really giving an insight for people about how they could live their best recovered life. And that's why I wanted to do this segment, honestly, about relapse and long-term sobriety. That is your story. And I think a lot of people are baffled by it. I want to dive deep into this segment here and really discuss, like, how does this happen? How did it happen for you? And how can we protect ourselves from these long-term sobriety relapses?
Damon, I think you said it perfectly when you were talking in the introduction that my recovery shines through, that I have good personal recovery, that it comes through in my personal life, because I would hazard to say, no, I would confidently say that that was not the case before I picked up a drink. I did not have good recovery. And that was the problem. That was one of the problems. And yes, it was decades. I lived most of my adult life sober or in recovery or dry or in a prelapse mode, and then finally ended in a relapse. In my 20s and 30s, I didn't drink at all. I had, and I decided after a period of time that time passed along and I could drink again. And so I drank for about 4 years, and then decided that I wanted to change my relationship with alcohol. We've talked about that on previous segments. I knew it was more of a problem. I knew that once I picked up a drink, I never wanted to stop drinking. Now, back in those days, that was 20 years ago, I could at least go to bed and maybe not drink the next day or the next day. And that changed for me in this last relapse. And then I went into AA. I found my recovery, had a great sponsor. I really was working the program, and AA gave me an amazing life, and I had an amazing life. I was successful at work. I got married late. I married at 38. I had a daughter at 40. I was hired at a new company. It was just awesome. And I could see God's plan for my life, or my life was unfolding according to the, some higher power. I could see so many great things happening, and I was involved in AA. And then, my life was so great. AA gave me such a great life that my great life took me away from AA.
Yeah. And I think this is exactly what I hear over and over and over again, and that's why I wanted to do this segment, because I think this is a really important topic, because I think for people that might be listening to this, Shauna, that have a year, 2 years, 3 years, maybe even 4 years, 5 years, they're saying, wait, you have decades or a decade of sobriety, and then you go out, like, what, you got everything, right? You got all the stuff. And I think there's a myth about long-term sobriety, as if, one, it's not the struggle day to day that it is the first year, right? Like,
Right.
I was on a Twitter thread the other day, and somebody was like, hey, it's my first 90 days and every day is a struggle. Is this unusual? And I said, no, if you're 3 years and every day is a struggle, yeah, I think maybe you need to look into that. But there is a struggle in early, but then you get into this rhythm and stuff. And like you said, you got all those promises that they discuss in 12-step meetings and all of that other stuff. Let's go up to what I'm going to call, you call the prelapse, which I love that, the prelapse right before you actually go out. There's something that actually happened in those cases, right?
Yeah. And it was a period of, right. And it was a period of time, Damon, that behaviors, old behaviors were showing their face, the the anxiousness, the depression, I was, overwhelmed, overtired, overworked. I allowed myself to be all of those things because I constantly sought more. I heard the acronym ISM for like alcoholism is ISM, I seek more. I was seeking more. I was seeking more money, more prestige. I wanted to improve my career. And here I had a daughter at home and a husband, and I was traveling for work, and I had my mom, and she was sick and dying. And I was, and I had my family of origin with, we were dealing with anticipatory grief. We hadn't had anybody really close to us die. And so we were going through all of these things, and I was empty. I was empty. I wasn't doing the things that I knew fed my soul, and I was trying to keep up. I say that, I've recovered from the Pinterest perfect wife, life, and mother syndrome as well, because I was trying to keep up. I was trying to keep up my house. I was trying to make my daughter's birthdays magical, her experiences. I was trying to do all of these things by what society was telling me I needed to do. And that angst that grows, and that discontent and discomfort, I was so uncomfortable. And I think the number one thing is I also took my main identity was in my job. I was a successful software salesperson. I was a sales manager. I coached people, and then I, had my own accounts, and I always did really well. And I was having a challenging year that year. It's no wonder I was having a challenging year if I was dealing with all those things. And I was like, oh my gosh, if I'm not successful, and so all of those things were eating away at me. And I needed relief, Damon. And instead of going back to what I knew would help me the most, I was already on the path to relapse. That was the path to relapse. I already had in my mind, in my subconscious, picked up a drink. So I couldn't go back to those things at that time where I was. And so I went back to what I knew would bring me comfort in the moment and a relief, and to be able to let my shoulders just go down. And the unfortunate thing, though, is we only get worse, never better. Having time doesn't mean you get better and you'll be a better drinker. Having time means you're further along in your disease. And when you pick up, you're worse off than when you were when you stopped. And that was my experience.
It's interesting. What you're talking about a lot here is powerlessness and unmanageability. We talk about this a lot in Recovered Life. And what I find that's interesting about relapse and long-term sobriety, or just long-term sobriety in general, forget about whether you pick up or whether you don't, right?
Right.
Long-term sobriety can be challenging with powerlessness and unmanageability because it's harder to see. I think when you come in to a 12-step program, or you go to rehab, or you go do any, right, you're freshly, newly sober.
Right.
The powerless and unmanageability is spilling, you open the car door, it spills out. Like, it's everywhere, right? Like your health, your finances, typically it's just an absolute train wreck. And it's very easy to identify and see. But long-term sobriety, I found that powerless and unmanageability can start stacking up. And it's harder to identify that it's powerlessness and unmanageability. That's when you need the people, that community of people around you the most, that can help you identify those things.
We have blinders on, right? We can't see our own powerlessness and unmanageability. We hide it in, I'm frazzled, or I'm frantic, or I'm overwhelmed. Just the words I used, right? I was overwhelmed. I overworked myself. I was seeking, going, filled with angst and whatever. And that is just what you said, powerlessness, because I was trying to exert more power, and I couldn't.
Yeah. And that's what I noticed with long-term sobriety, where really where that prelapse is the most. It's like the people, places, and things start to come in and become much more of a priority, right? Than actually what you need to do day to day to be emotionally and healthy and sober, right? It starts to replace that. No, I can take control. And then, so what happened with you? So this prelapse is happening. You're taking more
So
and
the
more and more
prelapse
control.
happening, and finally, I just, I was at a work event, and it was a big reception, and I'd gone to these for 20 years sober. I like never ever thought about it, and I was just like, you know what? I'm just gonna have one. I picked up, and I was off to the races. I didn't stop drinking that night, and I thought it was a blip. I thought it was a hiccup, because in the past, years and years and years before, I could start and stop. Or college, that was my frame of reference. We drank on the weekends, whatever. And so I was like, okay, it's a blip. I felt bad. I had remorse. I wasn't going to do it again. Well, maybe a month passed, and I was like, oh, maybe I'll just have another drink and I can stop again. And then maybe 3 weeks passed, and then it was 2 weeks between, and then it was 1 week between. But you see the challenge, Damon, when you've had long-term sobriety and everybody knows you as sober and knows you never drink, you don't have those people, places, and things to go to, right? You're still in your own, everyone knows you as sober. So I drank in my closet and in my car. Now, I don't suggest that to anyone, but when I was drinking, I didn't have good judgment, and I would go out and do my errands and, take a roadie and then stop and fill up again. So that was the only safe place for me to drink, was in my closet or in my car, because everyone I knew me as sober. I couldn't drink freely around them.
Okay, I want to dive into this a little bit, Shauna, because you're talking about this long-term sober identity, which I believe I have, right? Like, I told somebody the other day, it's like all my nieces and nephews, my family, everyone, they don't know me as a drinker. Like, some of them weren't even alive. Like, pretty much there's not that many people in my life that knew me as a drinker, right? So it becomes your identity, and it's such, when you relapse long-term, when you have long-term sobriety, it is a shattering of your persona. It'd be like all of a sudden, it'd be like if you've been an attorney for 30 years and you've been disbarred, but you can't tell anybody in your law practice, right? Like, you're living this life, right? That's very, very, very difficult. So you talk about having to stop, refill on alcohol, do stuff. When did that hit the wall for you? Like, when did you realize it's like, oh man, this is totally unmanageable?
I don't know if it was one specific turning point. Well, I knew because I knew I had a disordered relationship with alcohol. I knew, and I don't mind the word alcoholic. I knew I was an alcoholic. That had been proven before, or I wouldn't have done the program before, right? So I knew when you have a belly full of alcohol and a brain full of AA or recovery, it's not a comfortable place to be. I knew I wanted to be, I wanted to get better. My mom was dying at the time. So I went away to a 2-week detox, and I came home and I did some intensive outpatient. I was seeing a therapist. I was honest with her that I'd picked up. I hired a sober coach. I was willing to talk about it, but I still couldn't stop. And so it does progress. And I ended up going away to an inpatient facility, and I relapsed on and off for 2.5 to 3 years. So remember how I said at the beginning, I picked up a drink, and then it was a month, and then it was 3 weeks, and then whatever. So that would be the full 3 years. But for 2.5 years, I was in and out of treatment centers because I couldn't stop. And then I got really, really despondent would be the word, because there I was going to treatment, and then I'd come back and I'd pick up a drink and I'd relapse again. And I would say, why can't I get it back? I had it for so long. Why can't I get it back? What am I doing wrong? And so I would pick up, and I was off to the races. And once I started drinking, Damon, I couldn't actually stop unless I was sent away to a treatment center. I had to be physically removed from the alcohol. And I'm grateful for that. But, I had a couple suicide attempts because I was like, I can't keep doing this to my family.
Yeah. I think, people think though, Shauna, and I think why I really want to do this episode, because I think there's a lot of focus in in first people coming in and getting sober, or the sober curious, or people that have addiction problems, or, people that have, things that are going on in their life and they decide that they're going to get sober. And I love that. And I love focusing on the newcomer, like, because there's such magic there. And it's so great that people are getting recovery. But there's a lot of people that have long-term recovery, and there's not a focus on them, right? Once you get 5 years, I find it's like, there's not a lot of focus on you. It's just like, you either did it, you got sober, you didn't, you're still struggling to get sober. And this whole idea, and I think this is the huge takeaway from this, is that if people have long-term sobriety, when they hear your story, they realize, like, there is no guarantee that just because you were sober for decades, that all of a sudden you're going to get, if you go out, that you're going to be able to regain sobriety again. That there's a bit of a mystery with that. And thank God that happened for you, and very successfully. And you,
and I will tell you, I did not give up, Damon. I was driven, as driven as I was in my previous life, as a software salesman. I was that driven. I would not give up, even though I was despondent at times and made some bad choices. I would not give up. So when they said, go to sober living, I lived in sober living for 4 months. Go back to treatment. I went back to treatment. Go to IOP, intensive outpatient. I did that. I went to meetings every day, and finally, and there's a saying in AA, don't give up before the miracle happens. So after 2 14-day detoxes, 3 treatment centers, 4 months of sober living, countless hours of intensive outpatient. I think in my city, I went to everyone that was available because I kept getting, that, a sober coach, a sober companion. I just wouldn't give up. The miracle finally happened for me, and I am living a life of recovery. Now, I credit AA with my daily recovery. So I work AA, and it was interesting to hear you say after 5 years, there's not much for the people who no, but the gift that we have is to be able to stay in the program and stay in the newness of the program by working with the newcomer. And you alluded to that too, or you mentioned that, like that you love working with the newcomer. That keeps it fresh for me. So, I have sponsees outside of my work as an interventionist and a coach. I work with sponsees and women who are newcomers, because I don't ever want to lose what I have, what AA gave me. And I have a great life again. It's a very different life. It's a much simpler life.
Yeah, I love that.
I'm going to do a segment on that too. So maybe that's our next one. So I have a very different life. I'm not, it's just very different. We could talk about that another time. And I'm grateful for it.
We talk about, you talk about AA, you talk about 12-step programs and that. And I think, there is a little bit, sometimes I think, of a misunderstanding when we talk about long-term sobriety, seeking more, and AA. Like, I'm a huge AA fanboy. I love AA, right? And I've gone in and out with my relationship with AA and how I feel about it. But clearly it's a miracle. Like, AA just had a big anniversary. I celebrate that. Like, it is an amazing thing. I think it's a amazing thing. It's hard to even put into words about the impact that AA and other 12-step programs have had on the world. It's massive. But I also, at the same time, think, as much as a miracle of AA is, that and I think it's perfect exactly the way that it is. I don't think it should, people say it should change, it should morph. I don't think so. But I do believe this constant pursuing, which it does say in AA, right? This constant pursuing, if you have long-term sobriety, going to therapy, getting a coach like you, going to, book studies that maybe aren't big book studies, maybe they're philosophy, studying stoicism, being a seeker, being able to, like, question other things about you and how you act and behave, and right. These are super important in long-term sobriety. And I find that when people stop and say, well, I got physical sobriety, I'm just going to work with some people here and there, and I'll chair this meeting and give a donation every year, and maybe every 10 years go to a big jamboree or a big conference, right? You know what I mean? That, I'm good. I find that those people, and I was one of those people, right? Like, so I find that is, there's a lot of danger there, because I think it is about this seeking, right? And you talk about this prelapse. I'd like to end this because
Hey,
you
but
know,
I just want to touch on one thing that you said, or refer back to an earlier thing. Not everybody has to go to AA. Not everybody is a dyed-in-the-wool alcoholic like you and I identify, right? So if someone's
yes,
listening to this and they're like, what do I need to go to AA? I'm just a binge drinker or whatever. We've talked about that alcohol continuum. So I would point them back to an earlier podcast, because this is specific to people who had long-term sobriety, who got worse, never better.
yeah,
And then to your point about seeking more, the philosophy and doing those things, on a spiritual level, how do I expand my spiritual life on a daily basis? I might try different style of meditation or readings or growing in that. And so I love that you pointed that out, that we never have to stay stagnant. We're always growing and expanding our spiritual, emotional, intellectual, and our community within the 12-step program, if that's how you've healed.
absolutely. Absolutely. And you know what? And I think that is the big lesson here. It's having that connection, right? Like we talk about, AA talks about this. There's other forms of programs outside, right? Like you said, there's a lot of people who, don't go to AA. There's a lot of people with recovered life. And if you're listening to this, a recovered life, and you don't identify as an alcoholic, but you don't like your relationship with alcohol, welcome. Welcome. Like we're not,
Exactly.
we don't have a dogma with that. Like if you get something out of it, we're so glad that you're here. Welcome in, right?
Yeah.
But for the people who are listening to this that have long-term sobriety and they're like, you know what, Shauna, I've been listening to you and I'm hearing some of these things that might be going on in my life. How do what steps do you take to make sure you're not in a prelapse moment?
Right. Well, I think once you're in prelapse, say early prelapse, when you're dry, you're not doing stuff. I think it's way easier to get back on the wagon. So if you're hearing that you can identify, oh my gosh, back on the wagon. I meant back on the AA wagon. That was a slip of the tongue, eh? Oh, my Canadian just came out too. So, get back to the basics, get back to how it was, go back to remembering what you did in early sobriety that resulted in the life that you have. Was it going to meetings? Was it sponsoring people? I know people who have 20 years and they're not sponsoring anybody. I'm like, oh my gosh, what a waste. You could be sponsoring. Okay, that was a judgment. I shouldn't have said that, but getting back to meetings, enjoying the community, a daily prayer and meditation, living, working the steps, running through them again, if you hadn't been through them. And I like what you said too. Work with a therapist, see if there's other stuff going on too in your emotional life, maybe grow and expand your spiritual life. But if you're pretty far down the prelapse road, you can get into some denial, like, no, I'm not going back to AA. And you're really ready for a drink. That's a tough place to be. But I would still say then, just admit powerlessness and like get back, and gosh, whatever you do, don't call me. I mean, email me through the Recovered Life thing, because I'm telling you, the first time you get sober by grace, after that, you claw your way back. And
yeah, and I think the moral of the story here, the whole point of this episode is it's easier to identify and swallow a little bit of that humility to say, you know what, I might be in a prelapse, and to seek help then than it is to come back after you've relapsed. It's easier,
really
right? It's easier. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, because I don't think there's a lot of stuff and that's why when I told you I wanted to do the segment, there's not a lot of information on this, right? Not a lot of people talk about that, because I think a lot too, Shauna, just to conclude here, I think a lot of people that, especially in 12-step programs, and I find that this has been my case, especially if you work with others, don't want to admit that they have prelapse symptoms, because they don't want to come out to newer people that they're working at, showing that it might not work. And that's not the point of that, right?
No.
I've realized that that's not, like, sometimes sharing that, like, hey, I'm struggling too. I have 20, 30 years. I'm struggling too with these issues, is really
with
where the
accepting
magic
life on life's terms. And how do we do that? Right. Like, I am struggling. It's okay to struggle. Life is, when I say my life is great, Damon, doesn't mean it's not without struggles, right? It's just that we have the tools in AA or in, we develop the tools and acquire the tools to be able to do it. I think you're so bang on to be able to, say no to that pride and to be humble enough to say, I'm struggling too. That in and of itself can help a newcomer to say, okay, look at, if you can be that real and that honest, then I can too.
Absolutely. Shauna McKenna Vick, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you, Damon. We'll see you next time.
Sometimes addiction recovery can be a lonely battle, but you don't have to fight it alone. At Recovered Life, we're dedicated to helping you live your best recovered life. And that's why we're inviting you to subscribe to our free weekly newsletter. Every week, we carefully curate exclusive content from leading minds in addiction recovery, mental health, and all things important to the recovery lifestyle. Stay in the know with the latest news about addiction and get exclusive invitations to special recovery-focused events and explore insights tailored to support recovery from alcoholism, drug addiction, codependency, disordered eating, dysfunctional family dynamics, gambling, and so much more. With our newsletter, each week becomes an opportunity for growth, healing, and taking a step closer to the life you deserve. Take your first step towards a brighter future today. Go to recoveredlife.us and subscribe for free. Sign up now at recoveredlife.us.